Hi everyone, Phil Seymour here from IBA. As you can see from the slide behind, we're going to be talking about aircraft redeliveries today. I'm joined by Peter, Walter and Denis Brailsford. I do want to add a little bit of context to this. Aircraft redeliveries, what are they really about? And just to give you a personal angle on this, many years ago, 1988, I was working as a technical services engineer for Dan Air, and we had leased a couple of A330s from Hapag-Lloyd. Sorry, A300s. Don't think the A330s had been invented then. A300s from Hapag-Lloyd, and we were involved in redelivering them back. Unfortunately, the commercial team at the airline hadn't given us the full details of the redelivery conditions. And because we hadn't even heard of the term redelivery conditions, we were just a bunch of engineers. Transpired that there was a clause in the redelivery condition that said there should be at least 1,500 cycles available on each engine's LLPs. Nobody had even seen it. So we returned the aircraft, and of course the airline we were returning it to said there's only 1,200 cycles left on these LLPs. So you can imagine what happened. Those engines had to come off, we had to repair them. It's not a quick job. So I learned the hard way back in 1988 that redeliveries, as an airline, we better get into understanding the full conditions. I'd like to say that here we are, many years on, in 2023, surely everybody's learnt better. Redeliveries now must be really easy. It must be something that airlines are used to, something that lessors are used to, so everything's fine. I'm going to answer that question because the last redelivery survey we did, we found that there was still a lot of gaps in terms of what airlines thought they should do, and lots of gaps in terms of what lessors thought airlines should do. And the last time we actually put a figure on this, it comes out to there's probably an additional spend of a couple of $1 million per narrow-body aircraft, and at least twice that on a wide-body aircraft. And that's when everything is good. That's the work over and above what an airline would normally do under its maintenance program. By the time they overlay the additional costs of meeting redelivery conditions, it's definitely millions of dollars per aircraft. And if we multiply that across the aircraft world of operating lease aircraft, around about 50% of the aircraft that are flying over our heads these days, you know, this is a $1 billion industry in terms of redeliveries. So having set the scene, Pete, I mean, is there such a thing as a perfect lease end aircraft redelivery? What would the outcomes be for the lessee and lessor in that perfect world?
Yeah, interesting question. It will change depending on where we are in the economic cycle. But if you just take the lease documentation as it is, the lessee just wants to be able to operate the aircraft for as long as they can, take it out of service and redeliver it to the lessor with minimal additional cost on redelivery checks, shop visits on engines and overhauls, etc. and stuff like that. So it's the ability to dovetail the redelivery requirements in with your day-to-day operational maintenance planning, and it's when those get out of focus, out of alignment, that you really get into difficulties. Big area for the lessee is records. And obviously from the lessor's perspective, what they would ideally like is the aircraft to be redelivered on time, because they have been planning where that aircraft is going to go next. So just on the face of it, the aircraft to be redelivered in redelivery condition on the redelivery date without incurring additional cost and expenditure because things are out of phase.
I mean, that sounds simple. Denis, I mean, you used to work for probably the UK's most commercial airline, dare I say that. And that airline did have the foresight of setting up, would it be called a handback division? Was it a handback team? Do I assume that maybe your experience has been perhaps the lessors are quite awkward? Maybe as an airline, we've done all we can. Were there some redeliveries that went smoother than others?
Yeah, and I think the key point is you mentioned in your introduction, that link between the commercial and the engineering departments within airlines is not always well established. And having that link between the two to understand the commercial difficulties or challenges of an agreement, which may have been made 15, 20 years before of a totally different management structure. Understanding that for an engineering department is key to enable the redelivery to occur. Airlines have challenges that redeliveries, unless you are a large airline with 200 airplanes, redeliveries are not a day-to-day function.
Yeah.
They are a one-off function which may occur once a year, maybe even once every 3 years. And as a result, they do not set up the manpower and the resource to enable to just to redeliver aircraft. So you have to put into a mindset within engineering departments on why you're redelivering aircraft, why there are those challenges around the commercial points, and make the people physically doing aircraft, the work, understand why it's important to get it in that condition and the risk and exposure that the airline could be exposed to.
I think in a perfect world, I know we were talking to some law firms about this because unfortunately there are many disputes that occur. There have been some big legal cases about redeliveries of aircraft in the past that have cost airlines millions of dollars over and above what they were expecting to return anyway. So I know from one of the suggestions we had from law firms was actually, the perfect redelivery starts with the documentation that's negotiated to deliver the aeroplane.
Very much so.
The procedures and processes, timelines should really be established at the outset. Now, I know that's easy with hindsight because as you mentioned, we're still dealing with leases that were possibly structured less diligently, maybe 10 or more years ago. But I do think, what I would say, my plea to those folks out there who are listening to this from an airline perspective is, if you need some help with the negotiation of the lease from the outset, then, do reach out, because passing this problem to future management is not a great professional position to be in. And I know it's really difficult because I think from an airline's perspective, we see the press releases when they take delivery of a new aircraft, and lessors issue press releases about we've just delivered, an A321neo to airline X, Y, or Z. Those make the headlines. I never really see a headline about a redelivery that's made on time. But that should be celebrated as well, because an on-time redelivery is actually something that's not going to cost the lessor and lessee a great amount of additional cost. But I do think there are probably some key areas in terms of the top 3 or 4 items. You mentioned records, Pete, as a general point, back to birth traces, that type of thing. But engines must be top of the list as well. I think in our survey that we've done in the past, the engine condition and how that's managed, because if an engine needs a shop visit, you can't click your fingers and actually get it done. So I think engines presumably are top of that list.
And shop visit capacity is under real strain. Coming out the back of COVID, it's not just the airlines that have reduced manpower and staff. The engine shops have as well. So as a result of less throughput during the COVID period, they had to downsize as well, and they are rebuilding that capacity. So the lead time to get your engine into shop is now much longer. So you need to plan if your engines need a shop visit. The other thing I would say from an airline perspective is be aware of the requirements for the redelivery and look at that engine. And if it's close to its LLP limits, it might actually be worthwhile just taking it off, putting it in a stand, put it into preservation until you redeliver. Because if you burn it, if you're close to the redelivery LLP limit and you burn through it, there's no coming back from that. You either have to replace it or you have to pay quite a penalty to the lessor to make up for it. So shop visit capacity on engines is big. But then The same again with interiors and spares. Lead times on a lot of the equipment, we're talking about supply chain difficulties. So all of the parts really are taking longer in terms of lead time, so you need to plan much further.
Yeah, and I think it's logic also suggests that in a positive part of the cycle where the lessor has lined up the next lessee, there may be more of a willingness to negotiate around some of these things. But in the period that we've just been through, where lessors may well not have the next home, then that negotiation is presumably a bit tougher, is it, Dennis? Have you seen variations?
Definitely. You find that most of the time, even pre-COVID, lessors were identifying new lessees 1, maybe 2 months if you're lucky out. Before then, all negotiations were very much to the terms of the return conditions.
Yeah.
Once a new lessee or a potential sale is imminent, there is much more willingness to discuss potential concessions or changes to the lease terms to enable an on-time delivery. And that's always the key point for the lessor, is they do not want to lose that next deal, which could happen if the aircraft is returned late. So they want the airline to return it on time. And I think it always draws back to one of the fundamentals in both engineering and commercial teams, having a good relationship with the lessor and maintaining that relationship throughout to enable those discussions to be open and frank, so both parties trust each other and what they're saying, so that the best outcome is achieved.
Yeah, as that touches on something else we've done in the past, is actually benchmarking lessors and lessees, not from necessarily a financial credit worthiness perspective, but how easy is it to deal with lessor A, B or C in terms of redeliveries? How is airlines X, Y and Z in terms of their management of redeliveries? So I think that's probably changed a lot over the last few years, because we've seen a lot of airlines losing a lot of resource, and that's been a problem, and I think that will continue to be a problem, where it's easy to cut that cost of overhead, but in some airlines they're getting rid of the most experienced teams, and the lessors have also had their own changes as well, and the volume of extensions and redeliveries I think is going to be a challenge going forward. Just to finish up on some of the specific redelivery points, my experience has been, yes, engines can be a big issue because they are multi-million-dollar assets in their own right, and to get into the middle of an engine you've got to have a shop visit. Interiors, in returning a wide-body aircraft that's been heavily branded with perhaps bars and all of these other things, not just seats and galleys these days. Some of the branding of wide bodies is huge. So how does that get handled, Dennis, by some of the major airlines of the world? Do they strip those things out, or are they willing to leave certain bits in place?
It goes back to that relationship point again, because if you'll have the aircraft delivered in a configuration which is expected to be returned at the end. If you're changing that configuration through the terms of the lease, you should be telling your lessor that, informing them of that, and trying to get side letters written in to make sure that when you return, you can return in that configuration. Or if the lessor doesn't want that, at least you then know what configuration you're going to be returning in, and you can plan and prepare for that. Because it's key to be prepared, and as you say, there are a lot of components inside a wide-body aircraft, and changing that configuration is not a quick and easy and cheap thing. It's very expensive to do. So you can really be drawn in very quickly into risk of delay, risk of major expense, which is unexpected. So you really need to, I think, engage with your lessors to make sure that you do deliver the product they're expecting and the branding that's expected. And I think also the condition that's inspected, because most interiors are on condition basis for their maintenance. There is no maintenance program for interiors and galleys. They are just inspected regularly and then inspections are resolved. So actually, especially with things like galleys, bringing them up to a condition which is expected to be reasonable wear and tear, the famous words, reasonable wear and tear, probably the most disputed, can be very difficult to achieve. So airlines should always be trying to understand what that condition is and making sure everyone knows what that condition is. I've seen airlines with cabin standards manuals, so engineers know what standards should be out of a C check, what the standards should be during normal operation acceptable to a customer, and what the standards should be at end of lease. And having those sort of processes, procedures in place really will help you when you come to that end of lease point to actually even push back to the lessor and say, look, this is what we believe to be a normal wear and tear, and make that discussion. Because at the end of the day, it is an independent view on that wording reasonable wear and tear.
On the issue of interiors, we were approached by an airline in 2022 to help them in a dispute because they had refurbished their interior of an aircraft that was being redelivered, but they had refurbished it a couple of years out from redelivery, so they felt it was okay, but they hadn't gone through the redelivery conditions when they did the refurbishment. And had they just done a little bit extra on that refurb, it would have met redelivery conditions, but they didn't. By the time they were expecting that refurb to last maybe 5-7 years, when they actually ended up redelivering, but because they knew they were redelivering, they didn't do the full job. But of course, when they got to the actual redelivery, the lessor was saying, well, it needs to be in a condition for me to be able to pass it on to the next operator. And so the airline themselves had to do that complete interior refurbishment again. So it's the old adage of a stitch in time saves one. So if you plan for interiors, that refurbishment sufficient to not only get you to the end of the lease, but to meet redelivery conditions rather than just your operational requirements. And I think it's this misalignment between the business as usual engineering maintenance planning with maintenance planning with a focus on the aircraft being redelivered. And that then raises another question. If you're an airline and maybe I've got a youngish aircraft, I'm expecting to extend that lease. Why should I prepare myself to redeliver it? If at the back of my mind I'm feeling it's fairly likely I'm going to extend. So if I'm going to extend it, why should I plan to redeliver it? And it just comes down to operational flexibility and negotiations with the lessor. Either party needs to keep all of their options open and give themselves operational flexibility, because you don't know what's around the corner.
Yeah.
You know, when COVID hit, aircraft were on the ground. If lessors were able to redeliver aircraft, it could have saved them thousands, but they couldn't because they weren't prepared for it.
I just want to come back to the engine point that you mentioned. Spark a thought in my mind about, you mentioned about removing an engine maybe early in order to meet redelivery conditions, but we have seen cases where that may not be allowed under the lease. There may be limitations on how long an engine can be stored for to prevent that sort of action of discrimination, I suppose. That would you have done that if the engine was your own? Now, we've seen disputes on that, so do need to be very careful if those tactics are being used. But I suppose you say communication with the lessor is vital, because it may suit them, because actually if maintenance reserves have been paid towards the shop visit, the lessor may prefer to keep the cash rather than have a great engine which they're not quite sure what's going to happen to that aircraft. So again, I think that is crucial that the airline has the expertise to think through those tactics on the redelivery. But a lot of that can be foreseen, can't it? Because generally speaking, COVID accepted, most airlines will have a projection of their annual utilisation in rough order of magnitude terms. So even 2 years before the lease end, they should have a rough idea of their engine maintenance plan. I'm making it sound very simple, but
planning that out as well is key, because I've been in planning meetings, as you say, 2 years out, planning fleet strategy, and you're outlining where you think the aircraft will be in relation to the return conditions 2-3 years out. And if you think that aircraft is not going to meet but be very close, you will consider trying to rest that aircraft when you're not trying to use all aircraft. Which aircraft would you decide not to fly on this day not flying 2 of your aircraft on a day? I'm definitely going to choose that one if possible. Yes. And having those discussions internally can enable you to meet those requirements. But again, telling the lessor that as well. The lessor's remarketing an airplane. Is he remarketing that airplane fresh out of shop engines, or is he remarketing it with 1,500 cycles to go? It's a very different position on the remarketing of that aircraft.
Yeah.
So the lessor being told that and being informed that, they'll therefore remarket it as expected. If they then get a different outcome to that, they are going to be not against the airline, that's the wrong word, but challenge the airline on those areas to make sure that it is correct.
It is difficult though, because I've also been the other side of the table with it when I was working for airlines, where I was concerned about the usage of an aircraft that was a 757 at the time. Typically, we were flying 3.5 hour sector lengths, from north of England down to the Greek islands and Cyprus, with relatively healthy cycles. We won a contract to do some short haul services, and what that meant was, instead of 3.5-4 hours to 1, we were doing 1-to-1 ratios, beating through those cycles. And of course, I was the messenger, basically saying to the commercial team and the flight ops team and everybody, you know what, that could cost us a lot of money. Have you factored that into the short term or the 6-month lease we were doing? And it was, here we go. The maintenance guys are finding problems. So even within the airlines, there are those commercial pressures. But ultimately, even within the airlines, we mentioned it's one thing talking lessor to lessee or lessee to lessor. We said some of the fundamental problems are within the airline sometimes. So just understanding those commercial constraints and what the real costs are pretty crucial. I was going to ask each of you internally, Pete, what could airlines do better to prepare for the perfect redelivery? I think you've already said a stitch in time saves 9. I don't know how that converts across different languages of the world, but basically what that means is something planned well ahead of time is going to save you a panic towards the end. So yes, is that something that's going to be easy to achieve in the future, or do you just see more problems as airlines have to evolve in the post-COVID world?
Well, I think there are some things that can be looked at. Records was a big issue, and having the records optimised to allow a redelivery Bible to be constructed is something that can be done. It takes a bit of operational planning, but once you get it into the process, that you can effectively download that, or we provide a service whereby we will look at records maybe 5 years out and start planning them as we go, as a subscription service for airlines to help them with that planning side of it. So I think records is an easy one. The maintenance planning dovetailing with the fleet planning department is probably the biggest win we can get out of it.
We've had some recent experiences, haven't we? Airline, should we say, in Northern Europe with some turboprops. I think we were initially expecting that might be a problematic set of aircraft returns given the downturn. But actually, again, I think that came down to the lessor have found a new home, so perhaps that became easier. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, this was a project redelivering 12 aircraft supporting the airline. A lot of work went into planning how we approach that, particularly looking at the wording around DER repairs, structural repair manuals were reviewed at length. They spent a lot of time on that. And we came to an agreement in the end as to what was acceptable, because there was some wording in the lease that wasn't actually possible from an engineering perspective. No scout patches is a fairly bland thing, but there are some parts on the airframe where you can't do a flush repair.
Yeah, and again, maybe that's the communication thing again, isn't it?
Yeah, it came down to relationship and negotiation.
It does become an easy win for the lessor, though, if there is such an obvious thing that says no scab patches. Scab patch is really a double repair that you could visibly see patched over the skin, as if it is like a plaster that's placed over, if I put it in non-technical terms. Forgive me, those who do know a lot more about structural repairs. Yeah, we did see that clause going in. I think there was some, that actually came out of incidents way back in the 80s, I think, where there were fatigue cracks were then found that had just been covered over, and there was some, fairly serious aircraft incidents and accidents that was a result of heavily repaired structures. So we can see why lessors would not want scab patches, but as we know, even the manufacturers will approve them in some cases where necessary.
And we find commonly, again, going back to leases being written 15, 20 years ago, it was quite common to find wording along the lines of only having permanent repairs on the airplanes. Yeah. However, going to your point, fatigue and things like that, the manufacturers now, the majority of repairs, do permanent repairs with repeat inspections. What Airbus will call a category B repair. In a lot of older leases, that now is not possible to do permanent repairs because the manufacturer won't approve them. Right. So, as you say, if you were to hold the lessee to the terms of the lease, the only way to fix that would do a complete skin replacement on the aeroplane. Which, is that acceptable and fair as an expense when there is a solution which is controlled and managed by the OEM?
Yeah, I think there's, I suppose the lessors will say they're working in a global market, they want to be able to place an aircraft wherever possible. So would there be, is there any issue that would prevent that aircraft being moved from Europe into an airline in Asia? So that's why they're always very cautious. But I suppose in that particular case, you'd assume, well, if the regulatory authority should accept the procedures from the manufacturer, so you need to be looking at how that could be managed. One thing I would say as well, I mean, we were part of the IATA did have a working group looking at operating lease procedures, and IBA was party to that. I think it was actually a process that started probably 10 years ago. And there are some great guidelines on the IATA website in terms of operating leasing manual. Is there anything you wanted to add, Pete, in terms of any final comments? Are we expecting more redeliveries over the next couple of years?
Well, the data coming out of IBA Insights is saying that there are plenty more redeliveries to be coming. And you have to think that there are a number of airlines who have been formed in the last 10 years or so, and they've been in growth phase. And now they're coming up to a stage where some of those fleets are coming up for redelivery, or there's new technologies. So we're seeing NGs coming out, 320ceos coming out for new aircraft coming into the fleet. So there are lots of deliveries. And airlines have, it's not that we're trying to tell them what to do, how to do it. Sometimes just the resource isn't there to support a redelivery program, because we're all trying to be as cost efficient as we can, and all the engineering and record staff are actually there for doing business as usual, which is flying and operating aircraft. And it comes back to Dennis's point that airlines tend to not have a redelivery happening every day of the week. Something that we see regularly, we can help. So whether it's additional resource or support in planning, I think the one thing I would say is start thinking about your redeliveries not 3 months out, not 3 years out, actually 5 years out. If you can put together a task force that actually looks at what in-service operations to optimise it, you can reap financial rewards way above the cost of the exercise.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, good luck trying to sell airlines asset management for redeliveries 5 years out. I'd like to think that we're able to offer a lot of experience here from IBA. I suppose I started off by saying I learned lessons the hard way, and hopefully those experiences, those bad experiences, can be turned round into assisting the airlines provide on-time redeliveries. And of course, we do often work for lessors, though. There are a number of lessors out there who don't have huge resources themselves, or perhaps get unscheduled redeliveries. And we see our job, because I think IBA has been in business for 35 years and we are relatively mature people, we are diplomatic in how we approach the redeliveries. There's obviously a position to be taken from the documentation, but actually the last thing we want to see is lessors and lessees getting into the litigation phase. So hopefully the points we've discussed today will help in that thought process. As you've seen here, Pete, Dennis and myself are just the tip of the iceberg at IBA. We've got lots of talented teams out there globally. And without further ado, I will wind it up there because we're in the middle of some aircraft redeliveries right now. We need to sort those out for our client. Thanks everybody for listening. Hope it's been of use. Bye from me, Dennis and Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.